I am in Bellefontaine Cemetery in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and right next to this cemetery is a Catholic cemetery called Calvary Cemetery. And between the two, most of the famous people connected with the city of St. Louis are buried in one or the other of those places. If you're interested at all in old cemeteries or historic ones, you definitely have to check out Bellefontaine Cemetery. You can see behind me just one of many, literally dozens of large mausoleums that contain some of the elites of St. Louis. You'll see the name on that one behind me is Anheuser. You should recognize that, and we'll talk a little bit more about Anheuser and Busch families. This is actually the mausoleum that contains Eberhard Anheuser, not the one who helped found the company, but one of his descendants, I believe, maybe a grandchild or a great-grandchild in his family. But I'm going to be checking out some of the highlights. There are literally hundreds of famous people in this cemetery. If you go to a website like findagrave.com, you'll see they have over 300 people listed as famous. I'm going to hit some of the most famous, the most historically interesting ones. You're going to see things in this cemetery like senators, congressmen, governors, Civil War generals, quite a few of them, Medal of Honor winners, people from business, people from all manner of society. So I'm just going to stop by a few of those. Feel free to join me for the journey. So I've put my sunglasses on. It's a bright sunny day here in St. Louis. I am at the graves of two U.S. Army generals who are side by side, and there's a reason for that. The first one here is General Richard Mason. He was the first military governor of California. Ended up dying here in St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks while he was on duty here, and died. His widow, Margaret, then married this man over here, General Don Carlos Buell, who's best known as a Union Army commander during the American Civil War. He led the army that came to the relief of General Grant at the Battle of Shiloh, helped turn the tide of that battle. Later on, led his army in the field at the Battle of Perryville, where he performed, in many people's eyes, poorly enough that he was relieved of field command and then never served in the field again after that. General Buell was from near Marietta, Ohio, which is on the Ohio River in the southeast part of the state. He and his wife ended up dying in Kentucky, but they were brought here to be buried. So his widow is actually buried next to both of her husbands, her first husband and her second husband. Interesting note about this grave marker that you see behind me, and I'll get a better look at it for you after I'm done talking about it. This grave marker for General Mason was actually designed by the same man who designed George and Martha Washington's crypt at Mount Vernon. So same guy did both of those, and General Mason died in 1850. So I'll give you a better look at both of these graves. Well, one cannot talk about the history of St. Louis, Missouri without talking about the Anheuser and Busch families. Behind me is the vault for the Busch family, Adolphus Busch. Really quick summary, a man by the name of Eberhard Anheuser came to the United States in the 1840s. He was involved in business, but found himself getting involved by buying a struggling brewery right around the time the Civil War began in 1860, 1861. He bought this struggling brewery, renamed it the Anheuser Brewing Company. About a year later, his daughter marries this man, Adolphus Busch, who he slowly starts to hand off the control of the company to. And in the late 1870s, then Adolphus Busch renames the company Anheuser-Busch. I'm not personally a beer drinker, but I know that there are many of you out there who are very thankful for this man and the company that he created. So I'll give you a better look inside the vault of the Busch family. Beautiful, beautiful vault with stained glass windows inside. Not sure how well you'll be able to see, but I'm going to try to give you a good look inside. The next grave I'll be visiting is actually right across the street over there, and that is of another Civil War general. Alright, so this one's kind of interesting because this is not a grave I was looking for. I'm right near a couple of graves I'm about to visit, which are Edward Bates and William Clark, and I happened to see a name on one of the other markers that jumped out at me, and so I did a little digging to find out, and sure enough, this lady right here, who is not listed on any of the historical marker lists for this cemetery, this is Elizabeth, wife of John J. Crittenden. When I saw the name John J. Crittenden, it sounded familiar to me because John J. Crittenden was twice the Attorney General of the United States. He served as the governor of Kentucky. He was a senator from Kentucky. And Elizabeth Moss was his third wife. And she's buried here along with some other relatives. But not really a person of historical interest on her own, but she is the wife of someone who was quite influential in the early parts of our country. Little side note, something a lot of people may not be familiar with, John J. Crittenden's son from his, I think, second wife, and therefore this woman's stepson, was, I think it was John J. Crittenden III. He was actually killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn fighting with George Custer. So just kind of one that I happened to notice. It's right near William Clark's marker, which is behind me, like right about here, and across the street from Edward Bates. I would say that definitely the most prominent grave in this entire Bellefontaine Cemetery would be the one behind me, just because it certainly is set up to be one that is meant to draw your attention. This is the grave and the plot, really the family plot, of William Clark, of the duo Lewis and Clark, who were tasked by President Thomas Jefferson with exploring the newly acquired Louisiana territory between 1804 and 1806. These men did just that with an amazing group of explorers, including a well-known Indian maiden by the name of Sacagawea, who helped out with that. I'm really honestly surprised it's never been made into a movie. It seems to me like it would have been a very good one to have gotten to see on the big screen. So William Clark, born in 1770, you can read all about him here with the various monuments that are dedicated on his behalf. Later on served, was appointed by the president to be the territorial governor of Missouri. I believe in 1813 he was appointed to that job. Later on died here in Missouri. He's buried here. He had two brothers who were generals, including one that was pretty famous, George Rogers Clark. You'll see some of those names here because of a lot of his family are buried here as well. And I'm just going to go around and let you see a little bit of the plot here. As you can hear, we're very near to the St. Louis airport, so there's a lot of noise from the planes overhead. And this whole plot here, it's a really large plot with a lot of Clark family members in it. I believe these are probably some of his daughters. There's George Rogers Hancock Clark. There's a son named after his brother George Rogers Clark. Lost to us all in World War II. So I believe these are also descendants of William Clark. There's a monument here that was dedicated in 2004 at the bicentennial event. And it says here, this monument was erected by a provision in the will of Jefferson Kearney Clark, William Clark's youngest son. His widow, Mary Susan Glasgow Clark, was the overseer of the project. And it's a fascinating thing because, if I'm correct in assuming that all of these are family members, you're up almost to the present day here, 2015. We're still looking at members of the Clark family that are being buried here. It's quite a legacy to see just how much of the family is here. And why wouldn't you want to be? If I were a descendant of his, I'd love to be buried in the plot with him. Here's General Meriwether Lewis Clark, oldest son of the general. And then it even goes around to this other side over here. So literally dozens of members of the Clark family. Well, right here, in stark contrast to many of the memorials in this cemetery, which are huge and just really gaudy at times, this is one of the least standout-ish that I've ever seen. This is Major General John Pope. If you are a Civil War buff, you will best remember him as the commander of the Union Army that was defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Previous to that, he had been serving under General Halleck in the West, and before the war, his family had ties to future President Abraham Lincoln. General Pope's father was a federal judge in the Illinois Territory and was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln, who of course was a lawyer. And so when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, John Pope was one of 4 military officers who were chosen to escort the president-elect to Washington, D.C. Pope wanted to serve as an aide to President Lincoln, but it was instead sent west to serve first under John Fremont, who had been the Republican nominee for president back in 1856, and then later on under Halleck. He was brought east with much pomp and circumstance to lead the army after the debacle in the Peninsular Campaign. And he came and he issued an order to his army, a memo to his army, in which he basically said, I come from the West, where we always see the backs of our enemies, and that's going to happen here too. And then he promptly got his tail kicked in at the Second Battle of Bull Run. And later on, generals who served under him said that basically he had rubbed them the wrong way from the very moment he arrived, with that pompous attitude that he had. I think, in fact, it was Abraham Lincoln who said of General Pope when he appointed him, he said, I've always known the Popes and they all were great braggarts, but I've never known a reason why a great braggart shouldn't also be a great general. Well, it turned out in this case he was not. John Pope later served as a military governor out here, and eventually his wife died in 1888. She's laying here beside him. And then John Pope actually ended up in the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Sandusky, Ohio. I've been there myself a few times, and my wife has an uncle who was in the war, who is buried there at the Soldiers and Sailors Home. But when he died in 1892 at the age of 70, General Pope was brought back here to St. Louis to be buried next to his wife. They have all of the prominent Civil War soldiers marked with these markers here. You can see Civil War 41. And of course this one would be very hard to find if you didn't know that you were looking for him, just because of how low-key this grave marker is compared to the others. And just across from here, over there behind that tree, is where Adolphus Busch is buried. Behind me here is another Civil War general that's buried here. This is Sterling Price. Before the U.S. Civil War, he had actually been a brigadier general during the Mexican War in the 1840s. One of the few Confederate generals during this, or Army generals at all during the Civil War, who had been a general before the war even began. In the 1850s, he served as the governor of Missouri and was one of the few Confederate generals who did not ever surrender. Rather than surrender his army, he actually crossed the border into Mexico and tried to offer his services to Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, which was declined, I believe. He died not long after the war in 1867, was brought back here and buried in St. Louis, Missouri. It's actually a very large plot of Prices and Garths that are all buried here together.